Out on the canyon rim, under a sky split by heat and dust, 6 men came to drag her back, rifles strapped tight, a preacher gripping his Bible like a blade. "You were ours, Clara Mae." But Clara Mae didn't flinch. She planted her boots in the dirt, dust streaking her face, chin lifted higher than their threats. Her voice didn't shake when she gave them the truth they'd never forgive. "I don't belong to you. I never did." Behind her, half in the canyon's shadow, stood Kai, the Apache scout who found her half dead when her own people left her to die. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. Love like theirs doesn't beg for permission. It stands, even when the rifles are loaded and the world says run. The sun hovered over Dry Creek Hollow like a smoldering brand, baking every stone until the heat rippled up in waves. 6 riders reined in their horses at the canyon's edge, leather saddles creaking, sweat soaking the inside of their shirts. The horses stamped, nostrils flaring at the scent of the dry wind drifting up from the rocks below. Wind that carried the echo of all the secrets these men had buried in the scrub. No one spoke yet. Dust drifted around their boots, clinging to rifle barrels and sweat-slicked forearms. The preacher sat at the front, coat collar tugged tight at his neck as if the heat were the devil's hand trying to pry him open. He tugged at the slip of paper tucked inside his Bible, the bounty that named Clara Mae not as a woman but a piece of lost property, a name bought and sold on wagons they'd once circled around her. They all saw her now, the girl they'd called kin, the girl they'd once left bleeding where the sagebrush gave way to stone. Clara Mae stood barefoot on a ridge of cracked earth, toes dug in just enough to remind herself she'd survived more than the sun could scorch. Her dress, torn at the hem, flapped like a faded banner around her knees. The pale blue cotton was streaked with dust and sweat and blood that had long since dried into the seams. She didn't move. She didn't lift her hand to shade her eyes. The wind twisted her hair around her jaw and cheekbones, but she let it whip wild. Better they see her raw than pretend she was the girl they'd imagined on Sunday pews. Behind her, the canyon gaped open, a wide throat of rock and scrub and secrets that never asked for forgiveness. Even the buzzards circling high above gave her a wide berth today. Clara Mae had learned something out here. Sometimes the living carried more hunger than the dead ever could. One of the younger riders, his boots too clean for this land, shifted in his saddle. The leather creaked loud in the hush and his horse tossed its head, ears twitching at the sharp scent of fear. He was the first to really look at her, to see the raw places on her ankles where stone and thorn had torn skin, to see how she stood anyway, heels raw against the canyon's bite. The old man next to him spat into the dirt. The spit sizzled on a rock and vanished like a promise never meant to last. His gaze stayed on Clara Mae's feet, bare, cracked at the heel, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. The preacher cleared his throat, a sound too soft to match the weight in the air. His voice hadn't cracked yet, but his hands twitched on the reins, thumb rubbing the Bible's spine as if trying to scrub the claim clean. "Boys," he rasped, low enough so only the nearest could hear. "Hold steady. She's just a girl standing alone." But she wasn't. Even the horses seemed to know. Their hooves shifted in the dust, tails flicking away the flies that had settled, as if to say, this girl belonged more to the sun and the dirt than any claim signed on a paper in town. Clara Mae's eyes slid over each man in turn. She saw it, the crack in their pride, the question hanging on each tongue. She'd seen it once before when they'd packed up the wagons and left her for dead. That cold calculation that mercy was too heavy to carry. She tasted grit on her teeth, but didn't spit it out. Better to feel the earth in her mouth than the poison in theirs. The preacher shifted forward in his saddle. His shadow fell across the canyon rim, long and jagged like a claw. "Don't look at her eyes," he hissed at the boy beside him, as if Clara Mae might hex him with nothing but a stare. But the boy looked anyway. He couldn't help it. There was something in the way she stood, shoulders squared, head tipped just enough to catch the sun on her jawline, that made him doubt every lie they'd been fed. Far behind the line of riders, the wind carried a dry smell of sage and charred hope. It rustled the preacher's coat and made the pages of the Bible pages cracked like old bark. Somewhere under that coat was the scrap of paper they thought would drag her back in chains. But Clara Mae was barefoot, bone-weary, and unbent. She had learned that the canyon didn't care who claimed what, it only kept what stood its ground. Clara Mae's chest rose and fell in short, tight breaths, each one tasting of the dust that clung to her lips. She could feel where the sun had burned the back of her neck raw, the sting reminding her that this land had taken as much blood from her as these men ever did. She stood in the hush between words, the silence thicker than a sermon, while the horses shifted under the men who thought she'd bow. Her fingers twitched at her side, nails crusted with grit from the long nights she'd spent clawing her way back to life. She could still see that day when they'd shoved her from the wagon, a shape in the dirt, ribs rattling under a sky too big to care. They thought she'd break easy, a branch too dry to bend. But she'd learned something in the dark belly of the canyon. Sometimes the ones left for dead grow roots deeper than fear. The preacher's voice rose like a thorn, scraping the hush. Clara Mae Whitlock, speak sense, girl. We're here to bring you back where you belong. Repent this folly and come home. His Bible lay open on his saddle horn now, pages fluttering with each breath of wind, like wings desperate to take flight. Clara Mae's eyes flicked to the brittle paper, then up to the preacher's face. He couldn't hold her stare for long. She saw it in the way his fingers kneaded the leather binding, the way he hid the tremble behind holy words. A gust swept the hair from her cheek, smearing the dust and sweat across her mouth. She didn't wipe it away. Her tongue tasted salt, the echo of tears she'd choked back too many nights alone. She thought of every mile she'd crawled to find herself standing here, toes pressing into sun-warmed rock that knew no claim but survival. Micah's young voice cracked the heat. She ain't saying nothing, preacher. Clara Mae's shoulders rolled back, slow as a snake uncoiling. She felt the weight of their eyes. The old man who spat words like gravel, the boy whose boots were too clean for this dirt. They all watched her for weakness. But weakness, she'd learned, was not the same as being gentle. Gentle could cut deeper than any blade when it rose at the right moment. A tear pushed free. It carved a clean line down her dusty face. She let it fall, let them see it, not as a crack, but as the line where her old self split from what she'd become. Her gaze drifted from the preacher to the empty sky behind him, and she wondered if the buzzards would follow them home when they turned back empty-handed. She tasted blood at the corner of her lip where her teeth had split the skin. Good. Let it remind her she was still flesh and heat and will, not some claim to be bartered over a Bible verse. She heard her mother's voice, thin as wind. Better be quiet. Better be good. Better not let them know how strong you are, girl, or they'll come for your throat. Clara Mae's chin lifted a fraction higher, and the old voice in her head burned away like paper in a fire. Her words rose slow, so low at first that the canyon had to lean close to catch them. When you left me, you didn't bury me. You planted me. The preacher's eyes flared. You speak in riddles, girl. You've lost your mind to that savage behind you. But she didn't flinch at Kai's name. She didn't look back to find him, didn't need to. She knew his shadow hovered just behind hers, quiet, unwavering. The only man here who'd ever held his silence without trying to choke her with it. Her gaze snapped to the preacher's hand curled around the Bible's spine. She spoke up, voice scraping clean through the sweat and dust. You think that book gives you claim? You think your rifles will scare me down that trail? I crawled farther than your horses could drag me. I bled enough into this dirt that it knows my name better than you ever did. The boy Micah shifted in his saddle, eyes wide. He saw her. Not the girl in torn cloth, but the woman who'd grown iron from abandonment. He lowered his rifle a fraction. Small, but she saw it. Clara Mae's breath hitched once, the only sign that her ribs still remembered the wagon wheel that bruised them. Then her chin rose, shoulders squaring to catch every ounce of the sun's merciless fire. I don't belong to you, she said, each word falling like a stone into the canyon's belly. A horse stamped, a crow called overhead, and still her voice held. I never did. She felt the old chains crumble. She saw it in their eyes. The preacher's doubt, the boy's shame, the wind itself carrying her truth back to them like a dare. She was not theirs, not anymore, not ever again. Behind Clara Mae, half-shadowed by the canyon's raw edge, Kai Ten Crow stood as still as a carving in the rock face. He was the shape the settlers had never bothered to understand. Dark braids threaded with tiny eagle feathers, a tunic of worn buckskin that clung to his shoulders like second skin, beads glinting where the sun slipped past the canyon walls. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His very stillness spoke louder than any gunshot. One of the horses nearest him snorted, hooves skittering sideways when its rider pulled the reins too tight. The man's knuckles went white around the leather strap as he forced the beast back in line, eyes darting to Kai, unable to hold his gaze for more than a breath. Clara Mae felt him there, not shielding her like a wall, but standing close enough that she knew if her knees buckled, they would find ground again because he was near. He didn't lean forward, didn't reach for her shoulder, didn't whisper that she was brave. He simply watched the 6 men who thought they still owned her, eyes dark as storm clouds but calm as a pond at dawn. The preacher looked at Kai like he was a snake coiled behind Clara Mae's ankles, a danger best stomped before it could strike. His fingers drummed on the cracked leather of his Bible. Words caught in his throat, but he couldn't spit them out, not when Kai's silence made the canyon feel like a church stripped of lies. One of the younger men leaned sideways in his saddle, muttering under his breath, "What's he waiting for? If he's gonna fight, let him draw." But Kai didn't move for his blade, didn't even twitch at the rifle barrels pointing like stiff fingers at his chest. He just kept breathing, slow and patient, the same way he had breathed life back into Clara Mae's half-dead body on a desert night when no other soul would touch her. Clara Mae's eyes slid to him for just a heartbeat. He caught her glance, and for that moment the world shrank to the space between them. There were no rifles, no wagons creaking away into the dark, no righteous men clutching holy books like hatchets. There was just her and him, and the promise neither had spoken, but both wore like an invisible cord, binding wrist to wrist. She remembered the first time she woke in his care, how she flinched when he pressed the water skin to her lips, how he'd step back when she panicked, letting her breathe until she realized he wasn't there to finish the job her people had started. He had not spoken then either. Words had been useless. His quiet had been the thing that told her he was not another cage. Now that same quiet wrapped around her like a shield, a silence thicker than sermons, stronger than iron. Clara Mae straightened her spine, pulling strength from it the way she used to draw water from the cracked earth on a dying summer's day. Kai's eyes flicked from the preacher's trembling mouth to the rifles shifting in their owner's sweaty hands. If they wanted a fight, they'd have to start it, but they'd do so knowing that Kai Ten Crow would not be the first to spill blood. Yet if it came to it, he'd be the last man standing when the dust settled. A soft breeze stirred the feathers in his hair. To the 6 men, they might have looked like trophies, savage tokens of a wildlife they'd never understand. But to Clara Mae, they were roots, pieces of a people who'd learned to survive in a land that wanted them gone. And standing behind her now, Kai was that same lesson carved in flesh and bone. What the frontier tried to bury would stand taller than any righteous claim. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply stood, the quiet proof that some love doesn't roar to be heard. It endures because it refuses to be silenced. A silence settled over the canyon rim like the moment before a rattlesnake strikes. Too still, too charged, the heat swirling just enough to make every man shift in his saddle. The preacher's mouth pinched at the corners, lips twitching as if he wanted to spit scripture, but found only dust stuck to his tongue. His eyes flitted from Clara Mae's fierce face to the immovable figure of Kai behind her, then back to the shadow of the canyon that looked too deep to crawl into now. One of the older riders, his face cracked like dry bark and half hidden under the brim of a battered hat, cleared his throat. The sound was small, but it made the preacher flinch. The old man's eyes darted toward the boy on his left. The youngest of the bunch, knuckles bone white around his rifle, breath fogging in the heat like he didn't know whether to fire or flee. He'd signed on thinking it would be simple. Drag a girl home, claim a bounty, maybe get an extra slice of the preacher's mercy for bringing back what's ours. But what he saw, standing barefoot in the dust, Clara Mae with her chin lifted like a dagger's tip, and Kai Ten Crow behind her like a living stone wall, made his gut twist. A horse stamped a hoof, sending up a puff of grit that drifted between the two sides. The animals, more honest than the men on their backs, sensed the storm in the stillness. Ears flicked back, Tails twitched, jaws worked at iron bits that tasted the same as fear. The preacher's fingers drummed on his Bible, slow at first, then faster, a frantic heartbeat in a leather cover. He leaned forward in the saddle, voice low but sharp as flint. "You all see what he's done to her? How that heathen's turned her against her own people?" He looked at each man, trying to pin their wavering eyes in place. "She's bewitched, poisoned. She doesn't know who she is. Tertasami." But his words fell flat, like a hymn sung over an open grave that no one bothered to dig. The oldest man shifted again, thumb tracing the cross notched into the handle of his revolver. He'd heard enough sermons in his life to know when the good Lord wasn't listening. The youngest boy spoke up, voice cracking like dry twigs. "Preacher, what if she's right? She don't look bewitched to me. She looks done with us." He swallowed the rest of his doubt as the preacher snapped his eyes at him, hot and wild. "Done with us?" the preacher barked. "She's ours. She was born in our wagons, blessed under our roofs, fed at our tables, left in our dirt," Clara Mae cut in, her voice slicing through his litany like a blade through rope. "Don't forget that part. Left for dead so you could lighten your load and save your own hides." The boy's rifle wavered. He lowered it a fraction, shame pinking his ears. The older rider's gaze fell to the dusty ground, where Clara's calloused soles pressed into the sun-baked earth, bleeding at the heel from a sharp stone. Somehow that drop of red looked more honest than any sermon the preacher could muster. Kai didn't move, didn't so much as tilt his head, but his eyes, black and bright as river stones, stayed locked on the men's rifles. He knew what men did when pride curdled into desperation. He'd seen it before. A glance exchanged, a trigger squeezed because fear is quicker than reason. His silence said, "Go ahead, try," and the rifles trembled but didn't lift higher. One horse tossed its head, whinnying at the scent of sweat and dust and something sour drifting on the wind. The smell of power slipping away. The preacher licked his cracked lips, the Bible shaking now in his grasp. He leaned close to his horse's neck as if the beast could lend him spine. "You're throwing away salvation, Clara Mae," he hissed, the sermon gone, only the snake left behind the words. "When the winter comes, you'll wish you'd never turned from your own kin." Clara didn't flinch. She planted her soles deeper into the dirt, shoulders squared. "I already survived one winter without you," she said. Her eyes flicked to the youngest boy, softening just for a breath. "Go home, Micah. Tell your mother you brought no one back because there was nothing here that belonged to you." Micah shifted in his saddle, eyes darting to the preacher, then to the old man. No one answered. No one moved forward. Kai stepped closer behind Clara Mae, just enough that the fringe of his buckskin sleeve brushed her shoulder. His hand hovered near the knife at his hip, not drawn but ready. The wind tugged the feathers woven through his hair, carrying the silence across the canyon. A silence thicker than any gunpowder. And in that hush, the settlers looked at each other and saw what they'd come for slip through their hands like water poured onto dry sand. A girl who'd buried her chains in the dust, and a man who didn't need to roar to promise he'd defend her if they dared to try again. The last word slipped from Clara Mae's lips like a stone dropped into a well. No echo, just final. The canyon held its breath with her, every gust of wind caught between the cliff walls, as if even the land itself was waiting to see what she'd do next. The settlers didn't move. Hooves pawed at the dirt. The preacher's mouth worked open and shut, hunting for another sermon. But the words refused him now. His grip on the Bible loosened until the cracked leather cover hung limp at his side. But Clara Mae didn't spare him another glance. Her shoulders dropped half an inch, just enough to let her ribs fill with air that belonged to her and no one else. She felt the beat of her heart against her palm, raw and alive, and turned toward the shape standing behind her. Kai didn't break the silence. He never did. He stood a pace away, calm as stone, the last of the day's sun catching in the beads braided through his hair. The feathers at his temple fluttered in the canyon breeze, a quiet testament to all the storms he'd stood through long before her. His eyes, dark, patient, steady, found hers like they always did, cutting through the dust and the fear until there was only truth between them. She took a small step back, not to hide, not to surrender, but to close the space that had never truly existed. Her fingers hovered, then found his chest, just above where his heart beat, warm beneath the worn buckskin. She felt it, the steady thrum that had once lulled her to sleep when pain made her dream in shards. The same heartbeat that had watched over her, without demands, without claim. Kai's hand came up slowly, calloused palm pressing over hers. He didn't grip, he didn't pull, just covered her hand with the kind of care that spoke a language no rifle could silence. He was a fortress that didn't cage, a shield that didn't bind. Behind them, the preacher shifted in his saddle. One of the men coughed into his sleeve, but the sound died quick. They knew, anyone with eyes could see, that there was nothing left to drag back down the canyon trail. Clara Mae was no one's prize now, not even Kai's. She was hers, and he was the one who'd chosen to stand beside that, not own it. The sun slipped lower, setting the horizon on fire. Two figures, one pale and dust-streaked, the other dark and sun-worn, cast long shadows across the earth that had nearly claimed them both. In that moment, the canyon swallowed the last murmurs of the righteous, the gold cross swinging from the preacher's neck. Now just another piece of metal no brighter than the beads in Kai's hair. Clara Mae pressed her hand a little harder against his chest. He pressed back, breath and heartbeat echoing her own. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Some vows don't need rings or preachers or paper to prove they exist. Sometimes all they need is the quiet courage to stand, together, when the world comes riding in with rifles and chains. And under that burning canyon sky, Clara Mae and Kai stood, unclaimed, unbowed, unbroken. Out here under a sky big enough to swallow every lie, Clara Mae and Kai chose something the frontier always tried to bury: the right to stand beside someone without owning them. Maybe that's what this old story's really about. How sometimes the bravest thing isn't drawing a rifle or preaching louder. It's staying silent, staying steady when the world tells you to run. In today's America, maybe we're not standing on canyon rims with wagons rolling away, but how many of us have felt left behind when we were weakest? How many have learned that sometimes family can be the ones who push you out into the dust, and it's a stranger's quiet loyalty that pulls you back? Some of you watching may be older. Maybe you've carried secrets, scars, or a loneliness that no preacher ever saw. I hope this story reminds you, loyalty still matters, kindness still matters, and sometimes love, the true kind, doesn't need permission to stand tall beside you. I'd love to know what you see in Clara Mae's courage. Have you ever stood your ground when everyone said you couldn't? Or found unexpected family when blood ties failed you? Share your thoughts below. We read every comment. Thank you for riding with us through this story of dust, defiance, and devotion. If you felt something true tonight, please like this video, subscribe for more Wild West stories, and share it with someone who believes that some hearts can't be owned, only chosen. Until next time, stay brave.